What would you do if you saw a 6-year-old child being introduced to her future husband, 20 years her senior, not in a fairy tale, but in the royal courts of 17th century Europe, where Margaret Theresa of Austria was formally promised to her own uncle, Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, died in 1657 while playing in the palaces of Madrid. This little girl already bore on her small shoulders the weight of an alliance that would solidify Habsburg rule over Europe. Diego Velázquez painted her repeatedly, not as the child she was, but as the future empress she was destined to become. In those portraits, her childlike eyes seemed to grasp a fate she could not yet articulate. The story of Margaret Theresa is not just about an arranged marriage. It is about how European courts systematically turned children into living diplomatic tools, and how this practice, accepted as noble tradition, cost lives that had barely begun. In 1657, as Margaret Theresa turned 6, Emperor Ferdinand III died, leaving a power vacuum that threatened to fragment the Habsburg Empire. His son, Leopold I, urgently needed an alliance to legitimize his rule and unify the scattered territories of Austria, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. The solution came through cold calculations executed in the offices of Vienna and Madrid. Philip IV of Spain, Leopold's uncle, offered his daughter Margaret Theresa as a guarantee of a perpetual alliance. The agreement involved not only a future marriage, it established trade routes, military alliances, and, crucially, preserved Habsburg blood purity through consanguinity. Documents from the time reveal precise figures. Margaret Theresa's dowry would include 400,000 Austrian florins, rights to territories in the Spanish Netherlands, and a promise of military support in case of conflict with Louis XIV's France. To the Habsburgs, this 6-year-old child was worth more than entire armies. While diplomats signed treaties, Margaret Theresa continued her etiquette lessons at the Alcazar of Madrid. Already being trained for her role as future empress, she didn't know that her childhood had ended the moment her name was agreed upon in parchments she would never read. At 14, Margaret Theresa was told that her marriage to her uncle Leopold I would be celebrated the following year. What should have been news marking her passage into adulthood became a medical sentence disguised as a royal ceremony. The Spanish court doctors had already established a strict protocol to prepare the teenager's body for her imperial duties. Documents preserved in the Vienna archives describe specific diets to strengthen her hips, herbal treatments to regulate her cycles, and constant physical examinations to confirm her reproductive capacity. Margaret Theresa was no longer a person. She was an imperial motherhood project. The pressure didn't come only from her family. The entire future of the Habsburg dynasty depended on her fertility. At 25, Leopold I was already being questioned about his own ability to produce heirs, and imperial advisors made it clear that the legitimacy of the empire rested on the children Margaret Theresa could bear. The letter she wrote to her older sister, Maria Theresa of Spain, Queen of France, reveal a terrified teenager overwhelmed by the expectations placed on her body. "They speak of me as if I were a field to be cultivated," she wrote in 1665, just months before the wedding. "But I still feel like a girl who would rather play with dolls than think about raising royal babies." Margaret Theresa's marriage to Leopold I was celebrated in December 1666 when she was only 15. 9 months later, in September 1667, she gave birth to her first daughter, Maria Antonia. What should have been an imperial celebration became the first sign of a looming tragedy. Medical records from the Austrian court, preserved in the imperial archives, document severe complications during childbirth. Margaret Theresa's teenage body, still developing, was not prepared for the physical demands of motherhood. She lost dangerous amounts of blood and remained in critical condition for weeks. But dynastic pressure allowed no recovery. Just 14 months later, in November 1668, Ferdinand Wenceslaus was born, the long-awaited imperial heir. Once again, the delivery nearly cost the young empress her life. Doctors reported persistent fever, extreme weakness, and signs that her body was being systematically destroyed by consecutive pregnancies. The third birth, in 1669, resulted in the baby's death just a few weeks after being born. By the age of 18, Margaret Theresa had already gone through 3 pregnancies in less than 3 years. Her correspondence with the Spanish court became increasingly rare and melancholic. In the few letters she did write, she mentioned constant pain and a fatigue that never ends. In 1672, at age 20, she became pregnant for the fourth time. This time, her body simply could not endure it. She died in March 1673, 3 months after giving birth to Maria Anna, leaving behind for children in an empire that had quite literally consumed her life. During the 7 years she lived as Empress, Margaret Theresa developed subtle forms of resistance that went unnoticed by the chroniclers of the time, but that emerged clearly in her private letters and observations of her ladies-in-waiting. She learned to use her physical fragility as a political shield. When the pressure for a fifth pregnancy increased after Maria Anna's birth, Margaret Theresa began reporting frequent indispositions that kept her from fulfilling certain conjugal duties. Her personal physicians, many of whom had witnessed her previous complications, became inadvertent allies, prescribing periods of rest that she strategically extended. The young empress also built a protective network through the women of the court. Her letters reveal that she shared information about rudimentary contraceptive methods with other young wives of the Austrian nobility, creating a kind of underground knowledge that discreetly circulated through the imperial palaces. Most notably, Margaret Theresa began using her position to influence policies affecting other girls at court. Documents show that she personally intervened to delay the marriages of at least 3 young noblewomen, arguing that experience teaches that patience in youth yields better fruits in maturity. Ironically, it was her increasing frailty that granted her the only form of power a woman could wield at that court, the ability to inspire genuine concern for her survival, temporarily forcing the men around her to reckon with the human costs of their dynastic ambitions. The paradox of Margaret Theresa's life lay in the material opulence that surrounded her, as her health and youth were systematically consumed. As Empress of the Holy Roman Empire, she controlled a fortune that included palaces in Vienna, Prague, and Innsbruck, jewels valued at over 500,000 florins, and an annual income that would today equal tens of millions of euros. Her quarters in the Hofburg Palace were decorated with Flemish tapestries, gold leaf furniture, and an art collection that included works by Rubens and Van Dyck. She owned over 100 dresses embroidered with silver thread, a personal library with rare volumes in Latin, Spanish, and German, and servants who attended to her every imaginable material whim. But the records of her personal expenses reveal a grim reality. Much of her income went to doctors, apothecaries, and treatments for the physical toll of her early pregnancies. She spent fortunes on imported Italian remedies for back pain, French tonics for chronic fatigue, and consultations with the finest doctors in Europe, who traveled hundreds of kilometers to try to restore a health that was irreversibly fading. Her last recorded purchases include a special bed with supports to ease pain during pregnancy, a set of crystal medicine vials, and a selection of prayer books, all suggesting that even her immense wealth could not buy what she needed most. Time for her body to heal. The final irony lay in her most precious jewels, a collection of pearl necklaces that had once belonged to former empresses. She wore them in official portraits, symbols of dynastic continuity, while her own body revealed that this tradition came at a cost no amount of imperial wealth could repay. Margaret Theresa's death in 1673, at the age of 21, marked the beginning of a silent yet irreversible shift in the marital practices of Europe's high nobility. Her personal tragedy became a mirror in which other courts began to recognize the unsustainable costs of their traditions. Her daughter, Maria Antonia, grew up under the shadow of her mother's early death, and when it came time for her to marry, she was granted something Margaret Theresa never had, the right to postpone her wedding until the age of 18. This small precedent, set at the insistence of imperial doctors who had witnessed Margaret Theresa's deterioration, paved the way for gradual changes in other European courts. The letters Margaret Theresa wrote in her final years were preserved by her ladies-in-waiting and, decades later, circulated discreetly among noblewomen as a kind of silent testimony. These correspondences influenced a generation of noble mothers who began to question, even if only in private, the wisdom of sacrificing their daughters' health for their family's political ambitions. Most significantly, the portraits, by Velázquez, originally commissioned to celebrate her imperial destiny, became unintended monuments to human fragility disguised as power. These paintings, still on display at the Prado Museum, show a girl whose eyes seem to foresee a future she never chose. Margaret Theresa of Austria died before turning 22, But her story survived as a reminder that even in the most gilded palaces, some traditions came at the cost of lives barely begun. She did not change the world, but her tragedy helped others see that certain changes were necessary, even if it meant challenging centuries of imperial tradition.